A lot of times people will ask me, how can they create a memorable experience as a candidate? And the ones that I remember the most are the ones where I can remember how I felt. So I think of the quote from Maya Angelou: at the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or did, but they will remember how you made them feel. So consider, as the candidate and actually the interviewer, how you can help to create that best experience.
Now that is good advice. But I suppose that is what you would expect to get when you're speaking to one of the best people services consultants west of the Mississippi. Jolene Clark may have fiery red hair and hold the title of head redhead for her consulting firm. But if you were in an interview, you'd want Jolene to be asking the questions. Why? Because when you have a conversation with Jolene, she makes you feel like you are the only person in the room. I suppose that isn't surprising when you know that Jolene's company is built on helping other companies excel at serving people. Today, Jolene shares some quintessential career advice for both the interviewee and the interviewer. So, grab your favorite writing utensil. You may want to jot down a few notes.
In coaching people to how can they best prepare, even if they have no insight on what potential questions this specific person could ask, think about the how. How did you do this? How did it make you feel? How did that drive your results? Who did you engage in the process and when? And how did that change the outcome that you were driving for? So really I'm looking for and coaching people to look for that independent judgment and that kind of that critical thinking space.
You're listening to Glass of Water, where we reverse the role of the interviewer and the interviewee. The goal of this podcast is to pull back the curtain on the hiring process and give you some insights that equip you to land that career you want, rather than just some job you have. As is always the case, if you enjoy what you hear, please take the time to subscribe and give us a rating. Thanks for joining me today, Jolene. I totally appreciate your time. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So today I'm joined by Jolene Clark. Jolene is not in the office with me. She's actually joining me remotely for this podcast. Jolene lives out west, and I'm in the Midwest. So Jolene, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and the industry that you're in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm here in sunny but snowy Denver, Colorado, if you can imagine it. It's November. And I work in, I suppose, the human capital industry. That's one term, or human resources industry, one term that people, or many terms that people use for this. The people space is how I kind of refer to it. And I've been in the space for about 20 plus years. And I say that because as I look back at the numbers formally, post undergrad would be about 20 years. But really, I've probably been in this space interacting and engaging with people in a variety of ways my whole life.
Jolene, what are some roles that you've had in this industry?
Sure. So I've never been in a formal, what I would say call a pure formal hiring role. But I've been in every role that I've held throughout my career. I've been involved in the hiring process. So everywhere from helping to hire within maybe the first interview. So the either the phone screen or meeting somebody for the first time, their first interview, coming into an office within a company. I've been involved in a panel of interviews, so being on the actual panel, interviewing people. I've helped to coach the managers inside of companies or other people that are interviewing, that will be interviewing candidates for positions, and coaching them to interview candidates at every step of the process as well, whether it's their first interview, the candidate's first interview in the process, or in the final selection process. So it's and then everywhere in between, whether it's coming up with what the process looks like, how we track the process, what kind of questions we ask and when, and then how we engage with the candidate throughout. So it's been really fun that I've had an opportunity to negotiate and influence on both sides of the table in this space.
Now, you love this space so much that you actually have your own business now that actually consults in this space. Is that right?
I do. I'm the head redhead of Redhead Momentum, and we focus on building and strengthening teams around the globe.
So getting back to the coaching you have done, coaching recruiters how to do their job, coaching interviewers how to do their job, is there a difference in how you approach interviewing for high-level positions versus interviewing for mid-level positions versus interviewing for entry-level positions?
I would say not a major difference, but there's definitely a process, or I should say a framework, not necessarily a process, because every company is different. Every position that you interview for is different, and especially given the industry, you have to kind of understand the culture of the industry as well. So if you're hiring for, like, say, an entry level call center employee, would be different than you're hiring for, say, a C-level in Silicon Valley in the tech industry. Taking those differences into consideration within the framework, so it's like creating what type of an environment as an employer are we creating to help us be successful in aligning with the right candidates. And that includes wooing the candidate as much as we want the candidate to woo us. So I don't look at them necessarily like first dates. A lot of people sometimes will say, like, interviewing is kind of like a first date. You're meeting people for the first time. I'm like, well, that could create a not so good connotation, because a lot of people maybe have had some not so good experiences on first dates. So I don't want to make people nervous in that space. But I would say it's really using that framework and then just taking into consideration some of the factors that could be unique in those experiences. Like, are you meeting on site? Is the person in another time zone? So taking into consideration all the details that might seem like very small details that could actually have a pretty significant impact on the actual interview experience.
So as you do think about the coaching and guiding people on how to ask questions, how to prep for an interview, how to get the best candidate, what are the top skills that you would say, no matter the industry that you've consulted with or that you've worked in, what are the top skills that everybody's interested in seeing? Or do they differ per industry, or are they pretty much the same?
I would say they can differ per industry. I would think the top three, just like high level, outside of the technical skills, because those obviously we know are unique and different per some positions and per industry. One would be a healthy level of self-confidence. And I'm really intentional about the language that I use. And I show up the same when I'm coaching others in this process, as well as when I'm interviewing people myself, as well as when I show up in an interview as the candidate. So a healthy level of self-confidence. So it's like, do you look like you kind of put yourself together? And I don't mean like wearing fancy, expensive clothes or like doing your hair in a fancy way or showing up with like all that stuff, but do you kind of look like, you know what you're doing? Like you're showing up, you have this certain level of presence. A healthy level of self-awareness, which kind of pairs with that healthy level of self-confidence. I think of things like, are you paying attention? It makes me think of what I just mentioned in that last question. It's like those small details that can actually have a large impact. So, did you go to the bathroom ahead of time? And so like in the middle of the interview, you're like, oh my God, I just realized I have to go to the bathroom. Can you hang on for a second? It's like those moments that end up for somewhat sometimes good stories. So healthy level of self-confidence, healthy level of self-awareness. And then the third is actually two. So I'm going to cheat on this one. So there's actually four, I guess. But the third is patience and persistence. And I say that because those are the keys to, I feel like, to successfully influencing and negotiating. This is maybe my advice on actually just about everything in life, because they're very different. They're different skills or competencies, patience and persistence. And so I say that because things in the job market change so much. Things sometimes in the interview process change so much. And sometimes when people are too rigid, that can say something about them as a potential candidate when they're in that role and when things like that come up in the actual job or the company.
So patience, persistence, self-awareness, and self-confidence. Those are your big four?
Yes.
And do those translate well into, if you're hiring a person, are those the same four that you want out of a candidate, regardless of sort of the market that you're in, whether it's, a nursing position or a marketing position? Those would be your four go-tos.
Those will be my four go-tos, and I would say, if you imagine sort of like this, if you guys could see my hands, forming a circle or a sphere. If you imagine this like adding up to like kind of 100% or so, and they would flex, right? What percentage maybe might be more needed as a competency going into whatever that role is. And so, I think of that example of nursing. It's like, gosh, patience and persistence might have, be pretty high on the list when it comes to that. And then self-confidence and self-awareness would be, would follow suit. So I would say you could align all four of those to just about any position that you're interviewing for.
So if those are your big four, how do you determine during the interview if a candidate possesses those? So what do you look for or ask, or how do you, I hesitate on using the word manipulate, how do you orchestrate the circumstances of the interview so you can figure out whether that candidate has those four characteristics and to what level they possess those four characteristics?
Yeah, absolutely. So so there are two primary that I my go-tos. One is I have a conversation versus asking questions, and I do that by road mapping for, and I also coach people on doing this as well because it can create a more successful environment for successful interview experience. And so by road mapping, I'll say, you know what, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. I have a couple of questions in front of me. I'd love for you to be able to, to allow some time for you to ask some questions. So it feels like a little less like I'm going to be asking you questions, like institutional and robotic, which sometimes interviewing can come across because the interviewee and the candidate can both be nervous or have just different levels of anxiety about the experience. And that can sometimes not create a recipe for success. So one is having a conversation versus just asking questions and making it feel more like we're just having a conversation, kind of like we are here, and allowing that person to creating some safe space for that person to feel like they can share some things outside of maybe what they had already prepared or what they feel like they have prepared for canned responses to what they're told are common interview questions. And then the second one is seeing how people respond to things that come up in the moment. So, as humans, and people, life isn't perfect and we're not perfect and our days aren't perfect. And so if I'm in a space where we can't have as much privacy as I would like in respect of the candidate, honestly, sometimes people will come into my office and interrupt, like on accident, right? They don't know that I'm in there. Or they don't want me to have somebody to interrupt us. And so I see how the candidate responds to things that just come up in the interview, or maybe I meant to print something off, and so instead of having it printed, I don't like to have my computer up in front of me when I'm interviewing because I feel like I want to be modeling the behaviors that I'd like to see in my team members or the people I'm looking for. And so we have so much technology in front of us all the time. So as an example, so if I couldn't print something off, it's like I try to be transparent by saying, listen, I'm not trying to look at my computer because I'm not paying attention. I'm looking at some questions that I had prepared for our conversation, and I wasn't able to print them off. And it's interesting how you'll see how people respond to those things, and they tell you more sometimes than they realize that they would if you'd just been asking standard questions.
Right. So you keep those engagements more conversational. I've heard it referred to as more behavioral-based interview type questions versus
technical, like tell me what computer systems you use. It's like, I can find that information out online. But if you're in an experience where somebody can describe, like, how did they feel? And then how did those feelings drive the actions that they took? And then what were the outcomes from those actions that they took? That's very much in that behavioral based space.
Can you think of some interview responses that you've heard, or maybe something that you're kind of looking for in the back of your mind when you're having those conversations that will instantly give that candidate a leg up? Like, you're asking these questions and you're kind of in the back of your mind like, man, I really hope this person says X or leads me to believe Y. That puts them in that level of candidate that is going to potentially get the job versus somebody that wouldn't. Can you think of any kind of responses in those situations?
Yeah, I think when people are organized, I say this because I think of times that I was greener or earlier in my career and I felt like my mind was less organized. And when that's the case, it comes out of our mouths or sometimes on paper. And so when people show up with a certain level of organization or forethought, like, wow, they prepared for this, if even a few minutes prior to the interview, and it looks like they showed up prepared, they might say things like, thanks so much for asking. Give me a moment to think about that. I also think that's okay too. I don't want to get too far ahead and talking about things that we can do to help prepare the candidate to be successful, but having them, write down a few notes and then kind of sharing back their thoughts feels like they're being really intentional and thoughtful. Like they're thinking critically, they have independent judgment, and they're really trying to be intentional about it. And there's a difference with that with somebody versus somebody just saying, wow, I have no idea about that. Thanks so much for asking. I'm not sure I can answer that. That's kind of completely different playing field. But when somebody says, yeah, you know what, actually there are 3 times, I really cue into this too. When somebody says, there are 3 times that kind of come up in my mind that I can think about that I could respond to this question. Would you like all 3? Like when they really engage versus it being one-sided where it feels like I'm asking questions and they're giving me answers. And I'll say, oh, thanks for asking. Why don't you share 1? And then I'll see, if I'd like you to share 2 or 3. And they're like, great. And again, it's more that conversational style versus it feeling like it's one-sided. Because I definitely want to be a giver as much as I am a taker. And sometimes in interviews, I feel a lot like a taker where I'm just asking questions.
That's an interesting idea. So when I hear the word organization, I instantly think of, do I have my calendar structured? Do I have my day organized correctly? But what you're talking about is what I would consider thought organization. So have you considered the experiences you've had in the past, what type of questions you can anticipate getting in the interview, and then making a connection prior to having that interview so you're a little bit more prepared? Your thoughts are organized, collected, structured. So when that question does come up, you've actually premeditated on it a little bit or as best you can so you can deliver an organized response.
Yes, absolutely. And other than saying, the very professional organized response of like Google common interview questions, because obviously there are leaders want to engage in people with different ways. So while there are those common questions, and the people have that sort of like, I always have that stumper that I throw in at the end. I'm like, why are you trying to make it hard? Or is it just trying to engage the candidate a little bit in a different way? I would say, think about our resumes. The first line of defense, or the first time people see us, are sometimes, if it's sort of a cold call, if you will, like they've never met us, they're not in our network, is like LinkedIn or passing a resume along. And that tends to be a lot of the what. Here's what I've done and when. And so in coaching people to how can they best prepare, even if they have like no insight on what potential questions this specific person could ask, it's like, think about the how. How did you do this? How did it make you feel? How did that drive your results? Who did you engage in the process and when? And how did that change the outcome that you were driving for? So really I'm looking for and coaching people to look for that independent judgment and that kind of that critical thinking space.
What are some of the biggest differences you've run into as you interview candidates that demonstrate one candidate is better suited than another candidate? So you're talking to the candidate, they're giving you the responses, and you're like, wow, yeah, this person knows what's going on versus the person I just interviewed clearly has no clue.
Those candidates will share responses in reality. So there's like the optimist, the realist, and the pessimist. I fall somewhere, I would say, between the optimist and the realist. And so what I mean by that is there's like the optimist, like, well, we had this project and it was really huge. And I was on it by myself and I worked long nights and long days. And it's like, they kind of go on and on. I'm like, okay, yeah, there are times like that in my career where that's happened. But I'm like, realistically, I'm like, and I know in an interview, people are trying to call out like the best things that they've done or the most grandiose or the biggest challenges. I like the realistic examples. We originally said, when people describe things like, originally I was told that I wouldn't have any resources on the project. And so then I went to bat for, proactively, I went to bat for a few extras, and instead of 3, I got 1. And so the 2 of us worked together and kind of describing like, what is it really like in the trenches to work with this person, and how do they respond when potential roadblocks or risks come up, and how do they navigate them? And if they're unable to, how did that create the outcomes for the project? Just really being able to, like, I call it unpacking, really be able to unpack the situation where I can almost like feel myself in their place and like empathize while knowing they're still driving for business results.
So you mentioned before a couple of things you look for during the interview, thought organization, being, prepared before you actually get there. Can you think of some like red flags you instantly know this interview is not going to go well? I should probably cut it off right now because if we're wasting each other's time. Are there some major red flags that you can identify that, our audience, if they're going in for an interview, might want to consider avoiding?
Yes, I would say so. I have kind of two that stick out to me, and once at least one of these presents itself, I wouldn't say that I'm instantly sort of biased in the interview, but I'm like I'm curious. I get extra curious to see like, how consistent might this show up in the rest of the interview? So one is people not answering or addressing the questions. So, and I say this having also been earlier on in my career, maybe feeling like a few times I've done this in interviews. So. And this can kind of be the byproduct of not preparing, or actually just literally not having the experience, legitimately not having the experience needed for the job. So someone will ask a question and then they'll like talk around it, and they'll talk in very ambiguous terms, or they'll talk about something completely different, and they think they're answering the specific question. And then so that doesn't necessarily throw me off as much until maybe they don't have that level of awareness of it. So sometimes people will say, hey, they'll do a check-in like, hey, let me pause for a moment to see, is this answering the question that that you were asking, or can you ask the question again, or can you repeat the question? Let me think a little bit more about this. That shows that they're like present and engaged. But if people I've had candidates go on and on for like 15 or 20 minutes on a complete tangent, that's something completely off from the question. And depending on how much time we have, or my interest, I would say, in furthering with the candidate, I either will ask the question in a different way, or I won't continue with that question. I'll just say, thanks for answering, and I'll go to the next question. So that's one, people not answering or addressing the question directly. And honestly, even if I consider it I consider somebody saying, I'm glad you asked, I don't have that experience, or I'm not sure, or I can't think of something right now. That's still an answer. Like, they're still being present in the moment and directly responding to what I asked, even if they're not maybe giving me meaty details of what I want to hear. And then the second one is people being pushy or rude. So people showing up, this can show up in so many different ways. People showing up late, people showing up too early and then being like, I have somewhere to be, can you get me in early? I'm like, I'll see what I can do. I thought we had a time set up, but because I also look at those characteristics as things that could show up in the workplace. So if they're showing their true colors, so to speak, in that space, then it's a potential. I say that because you just never know. It's a potential for that to be present in the workspace. So maybe they're being unrealistic about the parameters of the job, like the salary, the locations, working from home, how much. I sort of hedge on this one a little bit, how much travel, because I've been in roles where I've been told travel is 20%, and ended up being 40 plus. So I think it's okay to have very okay to have healthy boundaries. But just thinking of things like that, where they become more fixated on like the environment of things, versus actually focusing on just having the conversation. So, and if it feels like I'm hedging a little bit, like I'm hesitating, I say this because when you get further on into the interview process, and especially I would say in higher level roles, like that executive director or executive or C-suite, some of these things can be make it or break it, which actually makes sense, like how much they're going to have to travel, obviously total compensation package, et cetera. But there's a time and place for all of that. It's just not necessarily in what I would call maybe the core interviews.
Earlier, we were talking about the type of interactions you have with a potential candidate. You do more behavioral-based interview style questions. Clearly, you probably have some set questions up front that are kind of go-tos, but you say, and you have this conversation back and forth. I think it'd be fun for our audience and also for me to learn what are some of your go-to questions. If you have a couple on that list, what are some you start with or you try to end with? What are your go-tos?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have three go-tos, and I don't necessarily always ask all three. So depending on where things are in the conversation or the candidate. So one is, how would the people who know you best describe you? People love to talk about themselves. I mean, here I am. Here we are talking about ourselves. People love to talk about themselves. And I say that in like an appropriately healthy way. They know themselves the best, better than anybody else. And so it's interesting how people describe how other people see them. And so I can sometimes view the psychologist in me. I'm a bit of like a psychology nerd, and a bit of the psychologist in me can see how these candidates say other people describe them. and kind of bump it up against how they described themselves in the interview, if that makes sense. So they're like, oh, when I'm in a situation, tell me about a time when you're in a situation that, you had to pivot, and how did you go about that? And if they give like kind of markedly different answers, that's kind of interesting. That's my Midwestern way of saying like, I'm curious about that. So how would the people who know you best describe you? That's one. The second one is, what is the craziest experience you've ever had in life? And I feel like, again, it catches people off guard. They're like, oh, wow. And crazy is subjective. So the cool part about that is it really gives me insight on kind of the level of experiences maybe this person has had in their life, and or what they're also willing to share. So I say that in the parameters of like legally appropriate things. So because I ask these questions, people can sometimes share things that legally I wouldn't be allowed to ask. And I'm not saying this because I breach anything from a legal standpoint in my interviews, but people will share things, that, and I don't write them down in this space. You're also not supposed to. And so it just gives me some insight on, what they really think, what is crazy, was it like, oh my gosh, one time my car was in a parking lot and it got hit. I'm like, interesting. Or another one was like, hey, I was in Italy, and we were like hiking in the, Via Ferrata, and all of a sudden there was this hang gliding expedition. And so instead of, going down to wine country, we decided to go hang gliding. I'm like, holy moly, tell me about how that showed up. And then how has that, and then that sometimes will lead to other questions. Like, tell me how that has, having that experience has helped prepare you for other things in life. And then the third one is, what is the biggest obstacle you've had to overcome in life, and how did you overcome it? And again, same thing. A lot of, interestingly enough, I won't say a lot of times because every interview is different, but sometimes people in all three of these will circle back to always like work answers. And I'm also in the interview process, I'm looking to really experience the whole person, because we're whole people. We can't, be like work Jolene and then like personal Jolene. Everything blends together in today's world, especially with technology. And these questions I have felt so far have allowed me to really provide a space for them to decide whether or not they want to share the whole person.
That's great. I like the question about crazy, because it is subjective, and who knows what they're going to share, right? What they consider crazy and what anybody else considers crazy are at different levels. So it does give you insight into that person's personality. And as you said, what they might be willing to share or not willing to share. I like that question.
Yeah, and it's not one caveat I want to give to our listeners is this: it's not a matter of having to have these, especially with social media too, being so front and center. It's like, oh gosh, if I don't have this crazy international experience, this crazy international life-changing experience to share with my interviewer, then they're going to turn me down. It's not about that. It's about how do they engage in their world, and how do they describe how they engage in their world, and how they respond to that.
So getting to the process of people trying to get jobs, and then vice versa, people trying to find the candidates for those jobs. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for either party? So if I'm trying to find a job, what's my best approach to try to make people aware that I'm looking, that I'm in need of a job, that I'm, available, versus, you're a company, you're hiring people. What are some good practices for you to have to try to find the best applicants?
Both sides of the table on kind of my first response to this. One would be your your network. So the people that and I sort of like cringe a little bit as I'm sharing that, because I always hate to fall back on the response of like, it's all about who you know, kind of that schmarmy sort of saying that, people think about, and then people cringe, especially because they're like, I hate networking. I hate going to these big events with a color-coded name tag. And networking does not have to be like that. And it can be different per industry and per position and per person, depending on what aligns best with letting that candidate shine. But it's about, having conversations with people like in life, and letting people know, what you do, what you enjoy doing, what you've loved doing, and where you've had challenges. And like, again, it connects back to me thinking to those conversations. And so, it's not that you always have to show up perfect in life. Like, gosh, you never know when it's an opportunity where I'm going to meet somebody, because that makes me anxious. So it's just really about how you bring your presence, how you bring yourself forward. And so that way, like, I think of myself now as I'm helping my clients hire or source candidates for positions, in that I think, oh gosh, you know what? I know this neighbor of mine And one time at a party that neighbor had, their niece was in town. And I know their niece is in this certain area of the United States where I know that there's, a lot of candidates in this area of work. So it's like being able to connect the dots. So I would say your network, that honestly is really huge. And that actually ties in secondly to an amazing platform that gives people an opportunity to build their network, which is LinkedIn. So this is not a sponsored post by LinkedIn from me, but I say that because LinkedIn has helped me on the hiring side of things, as well as a candidate. So it's helped me find amazing job leads, as well as connecting people to jobs on there as well, and finding candidates. So it provides a really organized way to do that. So I would also say in putting your resume online, which LinkedIn is like an living online resume, is making sure that it's complete. So, don't leave any stone unturned. So if there's things on there like boxes that say, you still have yet to finish this in your profile, finish it. So that way when people see that, they know. And then I know other platforms I've worked on too are like ZipRecruiter and Indeed primarily. So yeah, so those have been the best way to be able to create kind of aggregate pictures of like who I'm looking for and sourcing candidates, as well as places that candidates can go to look for potential jobs.
Yeah, I think first-time job finders specifically don't understand the value of LinkedIn. If you're coming right out of college or even out of high school and you're looking for a job, there is real value in LinkedIn. And I think they think LinkedIn is the lame social media platform. It's not the Instagram or I don't know.
That's our parents' Facebook, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's really valuable for employers to get some insights into individuals. So yeah, LinkedIn's a good platform for that. So to round it up a little bit, I thought it'd be fun to just have a few questions that are about what advice would you give X? So I have a couple X's that we'll fill in. So first one, what advice would you give the first-time job finder, a student just graduating from college? They're going off into the real world, super excited about landing a job in what they've been studying for 4 years. What advice would you give that individual?
Yeah, I would say focus on yourself and not others. That would be at least somebody just fresh out of school. And so within my consulting business, I work with people in various levels of their career, including the entry level workforce and career coaching. And so anybody that's, I would say within like 0 to 2 years, because it can be really easy to get focused on, but I'm not sure I'm as prepared or qualified as everybody else, or there's so many other candidates, there's not enough jobs like this. So I need to get this one. And we start, what you think about grows. And so if you're thinking about all of that, that's gonna continue to grow in your mind, and it's gonna show up in the way that you show up in the workforce and how you bring yourself forward in even looking for a job versus even getting that interview in the door. And I also say applying to jobs is free and interviewing is free. So where we're all in this space of coming out of school at whatever income level, I refer to this sort of the truly stereotypical but accurate poor college student feeling. So when people are like, should I apply for this job, Jolene? Should I not? Should I do it? I'm like, applying for it is free. Applying for the job is free, and showing up for the interview is free when you get called for that, if and when. So just should be present in your job search and show up and be ready. So you really literally can never know what's behind that door until you try.
Okay. Next up, what are you going to tell the person who hasn't worked on their resume? How do you encourage them? What kind of advice would you want to give that person?
Just like you would keep all of the food in your refrigerator fresh, you want to make sure that you're keeping your resume fresh. And I don't mean like every week or every day, but just like you check in your fridge, like, what do I have for dinner this week? What are my meal plans going to be? Open the fridge and you're like, son of a, that meat's gone bad. Like, can't do that. And then you get the outcome of that, right? You don't eat well, or you go out to eat, you spend money, so you get all the outcomes from that preparation. Same thing with your resume. So whether that means reaching out to some people, there's that network again, reaching out to some people in your network, whether it be like just, close friends that work in this space, because I do, some of my friends reach out to me in this space, and I'm happy to help if I can, and ask them what they think, or I would say sometimes I recommend that people go onto LinkedIn. Sometimes people will post their resumes on LinkedIn other than just having like the static content entered in the fields and people can see. Or engaging with somebody at whatever level works best for them to hire them to actually do that. So if you're in that space and you're like you said, 10 years or so, and you're like, hey, I'm switching industries or I'm completely shifting gears in my career, it is worth it to invest in somebody. And I mean like $500 or less. I'm not talking like thousands of dollars, to be able to have a professional coach you and assist you along the way. And then have some friends take a look at it, or even ask friends that you feel have been successful in their careers and say, hey, can I take a look at your resume? I'm kind of feeling like I need a little freshening up. I want to see potentially what I might be able to do to mine. So, and one key piece of advice, because I'm huge on mindset on a lot of this stuff, because it drives our behaviors and our bodies. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Because we as humans have a tendency to do that, including myself.
Yes, we do. Okay, last one. What advice would you give that person going in for the interview? They haven't been in an interview. Maybe I guess this would work for either a person who's never had an interview before or somebody who hasn't had one in 10 years. What advice are you going to give that person before they go in?
Don't overthink it. that literally is what bubbles up in my mind, because we do that. Don't overthink it, and like prepare accordingly. We tap into that self-awareness. Is this interview earlier in the day? Is it later in the day? Is it, get yourself organized just like you would hopefully for other things. I say that because we all organize ourselves in different ways. Are you should you eat ahead of time? Right before? Are you going to feel okay, or do you need to eat a few hours ahead of time? Where are you going to park? I say don't overthink it, because now as I mentioned all these details, it sounds like I might be overthinking it, but it's like by doing all of those things, you're going to be creating an environment where you can show up and be your best. And that means being able to answer questions that perhaps you felt unprepared for, or the interview goes shorter than you thought it would, or it goes longer than you thought it would. And so by being able to, it's almost like the hierarchy of needs, by being able to meet your own fundamental basic needs of the day, you're already going to be at that good starting point. So, and depending on what the culture is like, don't wear jeans. I just say that because whether or not, you don't need to wear a suit, but just don't wear jeans. And I say that because, again, jeans are subjective in today's fashion environment. And so by wearing something other than jeans, ideally that can create a safe environment for playing fields in that space.
As much we don't like to admit it, the visual matters. So presenting yourself as best as you possibly can is going to have a positive effect. So why not start off having a positive effect versus putting yourself in the negative from the get-go?
Yes. I don't know why I keep thinking back to food. I'm also a big foodie, as an aside on this, but I think about it when you're preparing for a dinner party, right? Wouldn't it be better to prepare a little bit more food than a little bit less? Because you can do something with more food, but it's tough at the last minute to scramble and try and figure out how you're going to feed people, or how you're going to meet their expectations if you have less food than you originally planned.
It gets back to that thought organization that you mentioned earlier on, being mentally prepared, and that goes for not just being in the interview, but getting to the interview, so you're putting yourself in that mindset in the best space possible to be as successful as possible.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Jolene, thank you so much for your time today. This has been insightful for me, for sure. I really appreciate it, and I'm confident that our audience got tremendous insights from it as well.
Awesome. You're most welcome. And would you mind if this has been a delight? And would you mind if I ended with a quote? It kind of maybe sums up, I feel like, so much of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, for sure.
A lot of times people will ask me, how can they create a memorable experience as a candidate? And the ones that I remember the most are the ones where I can remember how I felt. So I think of the quote from Maya Angelou: at the end of the day, people won't remember what you said or did, but they will remember how you made them feel. So consider, as the candidate and actually the interviewer, how you can help to create that best experience.
Thanks for listening to Glass of Water. We hope you were able to pull a few bits or nuggets of helpful information. And hey, remember that regardless of where you are in your career search, It's not about what you do that matters, it's about who you are.
This reminds me of two interviews that I had. One person had actually asked me the question, how would other people describe you? And I said, they would describe me like a mullet. And they were like, what? And I said, they would describe me like a mullet. And they were like, can you tell me more? And I'm intentional, right? On like, how do I like sell myself in an interview? I want people to be hungry and ask me to be curious and want to know more information. And I said, well, sure. It's like, I'm business in the front and then like party in the back.